The NRA avoids a court-appointed monitor. Plus, Kamala Harris walks back her calls for gun confiscation. All this and more on the news update.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the news update brought to you by thereload.com. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogleman. As always, Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. Reload.com is where you can head on over today and sign up for our free weekly newsletter to keep you up to date on all things going on in the world of gun politics and policy. This week, one of the big stories we want to lead off with is the conclusion of the second leg of the NRA's trial in New York, the remedies phase. And we have some indication, we don't have a final resolution yet on what's going to happen. We have some indication on what's going to happen to the NRA, including the fact that there won't be a court-appointed monitor, as the New York Attorney General wanted.
Yeah, the two big takeaways are no monitor, and Wayne LaPierre is barred from rejoining the organization in an official capacity, in a fiduciary role. You can't be paid, or you can't be an employee or an officer for 10 years. So those are kind of the top line takeaways from what we have so far. Those were the big asks in this case, was the monitor and barring LaPierre for life. Now, LaPierre is, I believe he's about 75 years old. So a 10-year ban, how much longer he could possibly serve after that is, obviously fairly limited. Though not, plenty of people live well past 85. So, but you get the idea here. The judge wanted a clean break from the past leadership of the NRA, is what he said in court, but he did not believe that a court-appointed overseer, someone from the government, effectively looking over the shoulder of NRA officials, was the right solution to the NRA's issues. This wasn't, a total vindication for the NRA by any means, but it was a successful defense against what the Attorney General had wanted. Because, she wanted somebody positioned there that would report back to her and to the judge about how the NRA's finances were being run. And the judge, agreed with the NRA to the extent that this is not necessary, and that it could potentially raise First Amendment issues as well, to have a court-appointed monitor there, which is, the political nature of this prosecution, or the politics involved here. Obviously the Attorney General, Letitia James, Democrat in New York, who ran on investigating the NRA, called them a terrorist organization while she was campaigning. That stuff did come back into play here. Excuse me. And while it wasn't enough in the judge's view to throw out the case under New York precedent, he did seem to consider that stuff when it came to issuing this ruling. At the same time, though, right, he wasn't saying that he didn't necessarily agree with the NRA's longstanding position that the problems were isolated to specific individuals and that they'd already been fixed really years ago. That's what the NRA has been claiming for a long time, even though they've put out a bunch of new reforms all along the way, including literally right before this phase of the trial began. The audit committee put out a document of reforms that they were wanting to implement. So the judge recognized all these things. I think he took this case very seriously from everything I can tell. And he rejected the monitor, said LaPierre can't rejoin the organization in official capacity for 10 years. But what we don't know yet is the full outcome of what's going to happen with the NRA. That seems like it would be because those were the big picture things. But there's actually more going on, because he read off a list of 6 reforms that he would like the NRA to implement in some form or another, and that he was essentially saying that it's up to him. I did an analysis piece where I went through some of the transcript where he talks about this. And essentially he's saying it'll be up to him how this stuff gets implemented. He's going to give the NRA and the AG time, about a week, it seems, to go over the suggestions that he put out discuss the details, any possible changes or what have you to them, and then report back to him, send him briefs on, I guess, the feasibility of some of these things or the best way to implement them, whether it's by court order or consent decree, something along those lines. And then he would decide what to do at that point. So, it's really not over yet. We don't know the fate of the NRA because these changes are not insignificant. They are things the judge feels would benefit the NRA that, frankly, reformers have been looking for quite a while at the NRA. Will be a list of things that a lot of NRA reformers have wanted. Now, we've talked to some of the reformers on the show before, and some of them want much more than what's in these reforms. They want things like firing the NRA's lawyers, the Brewer firm, even trying to get money back from them. None of that is included in this, but it does have things like shrinking the size of the board. The NRA board has 76 members. That's been a long time complaint of a lot of NRA reformers. You've got making it easier to get on the ballot for board elections. That's a long time complaint that the nominating committee has too much control over who can even run for the board. And the judge seemed to agree with that idea and wants to at least loosen those rules temporarily. You also have the idea of taking some people off of at least the audit committee. Right now, the chair of the audit committee was, I believe he was the chair's former NRA president, Charles Cotton, who was already the chair of the audit committee during the time that the jury identified all these problems with the way the NRA was being run, related party transactions, things like that were approved by the audit committee, ended up being found to be an issue by the jury. And so the judge is saying, you should remove people like that from that position, at least. That's one of the reforms he's suggesting. And then you also have things like strengthening the new chief compliance officer position that the NRA has voluntarily internally adopted itself, essentially putting protections around his job to prevent internal interference, and then also potentially appointing a in-house consultant, one that wouldn't be overseen by the court or the AG, but would help that compliance officer. So, these are fairly significant things that would likely change how the NRA operates, but also the balance of power inside the organization. Obviously we saw in the last board and leadership elections that the reformers have gained quite a lot of ground, and there's a lot more of them inside the NRA than there used to be, or at least a lot more people have come to their view that things need to be fairly significantly reformed inside of the group moving forward. So these sorts of reforms, I think, would go a long way in that internal struggle. And we'll have to see exactly how they come out and exactly what the judge does. We won't know probably for another week or two on that front.
Yeah, but Reload members should check out that analysis piece where you walk through some of the options, and you should check out our weekend interview podcast because we're doing a special Q&A, and we're going to get, I assume, more in depth into some of these potential avenues that the NRA might go down. Moving on to the next big story we want to talk about this week is that we now have official confirmation from the Kamala Harris campaign about her shifting stance, you could say, on mandatory buybacks for assault weapons, aka gun confiscation. The New York Times did a report where they had, on background, an unnamed source in the Kamala Harris campaign saying she no longer supports a mandatory buyback. And then we officially got someone on the record from the campaign to say that is correct. She does not, in fact, wish to force owners of AR-15s and similar weapons to sell them to the government.
Right. Well, she said it was Lauren Hitt, I believe is how you pronounce her name. She's a campaign spokeswoman. And she said that Kamala Harris would not push for it as president. So to be very clear about language, I know people are understandably want to be extremely clear about exactly what her position is, or at least what her campaign says her position is, right? Because we haven't heard from Kamala Harris herself. And I don't think there's any reason to think her campaign is speaking out of turn. She doesn't hold this new position. But it's always better if a candidate sits down and talks, at least themselves goes out and talks about what their positions are. And better than that, sits down and does an interview with reporters. Like, I would be more than glad to do an interview with Kamala Harris about what exactly her position is and why it changed. These are things we asked the campaign, but they did not respond. We published literally everything that they sent us, which includes the confirmation that she is no longer going to push for a mandatory buyback of firearms like the popular AR-15 if she were to become president. And also that she still supports 3 policies they named specifically, which also happen to be the 3 policies she has called out repeatedly in her relatively short time running for president. But red flag laws, universal background checks, and an assault weapons ban. And, she's saying she wants to ban the sale of assault weapons, or at least, and to be honest, she hasn't really detailed that position either. It just says assault weapons ban. That can mean a couple of things because, for instance, if she's just going with the Biden campaign, with what President Biden has been put out there as his policy positions, that could mean a number of things. An assault weapons ban traditionally has just been a ban on sales with grandfathered provisions for current owners. So you could continue to keep the firearms you have, but you can't buy new ones. Oftentimes you can't sell the ones you have or transfer them. That's another, and it differs from state to state. But that's generally how these things go. And then obviously the next step, or the final step, would be something like what Kamala Harris has previously supported repeatedly during her 2020 campaign, right? She was on the record over and over again saying this, which would be a mandatory buyback, Australian style gun confiscation. Essentially, you have no choice but to sell, quote unquote, your gun back to the government. It's really just confiscation with a remittance attached to it, right? Of some sort that the government would determine. Like, you don't get to, presumably, you would not get to set the price in this sort of scheme. It's not something that has been tried here in the U.S. Buybacks in the U.S. have always been these voluntary things that kind of become a joke, to be honest. Like, you'll see gun owners go out and sort of either buy guns from people waiting in line that are more valuable than whatever the police are offering, or they'll turn in homemade guns that are like basically a piece of wood and some plastic or a metal tube that technically can be classed as a firearm for the buyback, that kind of stuff. And studies have shown they don't really have much of an impact at all. But they've always been voluntary things. And so the U.S. has never tried this. Australia has tried it, or did it, in the 90s, which, again, Kamala Harris, even as vice president, has praised that approach before, she became the presidential candidate. She praised the Australian approach. But, that's your far end of the spectrum of when it comes to assault weapons ban, basically forcing everyone who already has them. And there's upwards of 24 million, just what the National Shooting Sports Foundation, the gun industry trade group, calls modern sporting rifles, which are essentially AK-47s and AR-15s, the semi-automatic versions of those firearms in civilian hands. There's a lot of them out there. Just to give some perspective, the total number of small arms in the U.S. military stockpile, according to the Small Arms Survey, is 4 million. So just people don't usually, you hear 24 million, they don't understand how big that number is. So just to give you some context for it and how sort of impractical this concept is regardless. But so that's the far end. In the middle, you have this, in the middle of these proposals, these assault and ban proposals, you also have what Joe Biden has supported in the past, which was a ban on sales and also a requirement for registration under the National Firearms Act, which is very similar to what he has done, or what his administration has done with pistol braced guns, where, you could keep until that was blocked by the federal court, the way the rule worked was that you couldn't buy or sell them anymore, but you could keep them as long as you registered them onto the NFA. And they even waived the tax stamp cost to do that. So it's not even quite clear where Kamala is today on just that she wants some kind of assault weapons ban, but she won't push for a mandatory buyback. Now, that is a walk back from what her previous position was, but it's not a very detailed one.
Yeah. And like you said, she still hasn't, said it herself. She hasn't sat down for an on the record interview to explain sort of her changing positions, but we'll of course keep listeners up to date. If that does change, we'll see.
Yeah. And it's part of a broader walk back of a bunch of positions, right? She took a lot of positions well to the left of most Americans during the 2020 primary campaign. That's something a lot of politicians will do in primaries, but also the 2020 Democratic primary campaign was particularly prone to this, where you had a lot of, given all of the wild things that occurred in 2020, some of the Democratic reactions to those during the primary were pretty far out there. And so she's had to walk back a bunch of things. This was just one of them. Right.
And listeners can determine for themselves how sincere they think she is and whether she would govern that way if elected. So, but speaking of assault weapon bans, the third big story that we covered this week that we want to talk about today is an interesting ruling out of New Jersey on that state's so-called assault weapon ban, because a federal judge struck down their assault weapon ban. He sort of cabined his ruling to a particular kind of assault weapon, but also upheld the state's large capacity magazine ban. So that's sort of an unusual ruling. You don't typically see. It usually goes one way or the other. And in this case, the judge sort of split the ruling.
Yeah. And it's especially interesting because it's a consolidated case that includes one of the cases that the Supreme Court GVR'd, granted, vacated, and remanded during Bruin or immediately after Bruin, which was the case against New Jersey's magazine ban, which, if you remember, New Jersey lowered their magazine capacity limit from 15 to 10. And then they said everything that fell into that 10 to 15 range was no longer illegal to even possess. So technically on that front, he ruled in favor of the state. But this became combined with a case against the state's assault weapons ban, where he ruled against just specifically the ban on AR-15s, which is a very strange outcome. You haven't seen this done anywhere else in the country, frankly. The reason he did that, according to the ruling, is that he felt he was only really briefed on the details of the AR-15, that the case was so focused on the AR-15 itself that he didn't feel that the other provisions, the other guns covered by the state's assault weapons ban, were briefed well enough. They were even challenged. Essentially, he kind of implied that you'd have to go back and challenge all the other provisions if you want to get to the bottom of whether they violate the Second Amendment under Bruin. But he did determine that the ban on the AR-15 does violate the Second Amendment under Bruin, and it's while also upholding the magazine bans. It's kind of fascinating thing. And you could, and while he's a George W. Bush appointee, he clearly does not like the Second Amendment jurisprudence coming from the Supreme Court. He has a whole section where he talks about how much he dislikes it. But he also explains that he feels that he is bound by it because it is Supreme Court precedent. And so, it could be influential just because this is one of those GVR cases. But at the same time, it's very unique. I think this is something that you are even considering maybe doing an analysis piece on, looking at kind of the intricacies of this ruling, right?
Yeah. Members can stay tuned for that, because I think I am going to write, because it really is a fascinating ruling. It has a lot of different wrinkles. Like you said, he's clearly not a fan of Bruin, and he's not a fan of, he seems like he's not really a fan of AR-15s. He kind of, he hints that he wishes there was policy choices to be made to deal with gun violence and mass shootings and all that. But he says he feels obligated. And it's extra interesting to me because I've written about before the fact that there's sort of been a consolidated approach that judges have taken to upholding hardware bans, judges that feel prone to upholding them. And it's interesting to see this case where this judge maybe personally feels sympathetic to those arguments, nevertheless stays to an analysis of Bruin that strikes down an AR-15 ban. That's just totally not something we've seen before. So I think I'm going to walk readers through that because I think it's just unusual.
Yeah. And at the same time, he also does use that sort of hardware ban logic, the logic to uphold hardware bans that we've seen before, to uphold the magazine ban. I guess I don't know, you'll get more into this in your piece, but it felt to me like his main distinction between the AR-15s, which he agreed were in common use, essentially that they were very popular. People used them for self-defense inside the home, and magazines that hold more than 10 rounds, which are also extremely even more popular than AR-15s. There's probably, I don't know, billions of them out there, maybe, because every AR-15 has come in the vast majority of states comes with 30-round magazine standard. It's not uncommon for people to buy, 5, 10 magazines for their guns. There's plenty of people who just have whatever the gun came with, but there's lots and lots of people who buy more. Right. Regardless, he seemed to think that because the AR-15 ban was categorical in the sense that it bans all AR-15s, that was the issue. Whereas the magazine limit doesn't ban all magazines, just ones that hold more than 10 rounds. I don't know. It'd be interesting to see what you write, because that was the only discernible difference I could find in his reasoning between the two devices, because there didn't seem to be a lot of justification for why these things were why he took the analysis so differently for him. Because he used that, modern concern of mass shootings to use a broader analytical view of historical analogs to uphold the magazine ban, which he did mainly on the basis of the existence of Bowie knife restrictions, right. Which is, a common argument you see in those sorts of cases where hardware restrictions are upheld. But I don't know, it is really fascinating for sure. And I look forward to reading what you've got.
Yeah, listeners should stay tuned. But heading into some of our quick hits that we're going to wrap up with and some newsletter links, we have 2 separate news stories about what the gun control groups have announced that they plan to do to support pro-gun control candidates, including Vice President and now presidential nominee, Kamala Harris. So we now have Giffords on the record saying that they plan to spend $15 million. And shortly after there, Everytown came out and said that they plan to spend $45 million. So collectively $60 million in pledges in campaign spending for this upcoming election, which, if it comes to fruition, would be a massive step for the gun control movement. Yeah.
And I don't know. It's very interesting. There would be a huge, another $60 million in this campaign where they haven't really been raising money that well to this point. Right. We've obviously been covering this since, early this year, where, because they have to disclose what their political action committees and their super PACs are raising on a monthly basis. And, so does the NRA and the gun rights groups. And we've been tracking that money fight the whole time. And the noticeable thing is that the NRA has been struggling significantly more than everyone else. And so you're seeing the gun control groups commonly overtake them in fundraising for these political groups. But it's not because the gun control groups have significantly increased their fundraising. In fact, their fundraising is also significantly down from the heights of cycles like 2016. The NRA last month, they were down from 1.3 million brought into their PAC in 2016 to about $500,000 this cycle over the same month in June. Those are the most recent numbers we have from June. And you look at Giffords, their PAC went from 1.2 million to like 400,000. So they're really falling by actually even more, I believe. If I remember, I'd have to go back and look at the piece, but they're on pretty much on pace, maybe a little bit less severe than the NRA's downturn most months. But and that's why they've been able to pull ahead as like a collective group of gun control groups. You combine Everytown, Giffords, and Brady, they will often outpace NRA in the relatively minor fundraising efforts of the other gun rights groups, their political fundraising efforts. So this is kind of surprising and a bit out of the blue, right? To see them just say, oh yeah, by the way, we're actually going to spend way more than anything we've raised to this point, because neither one of them have raised anywhere near that kind of money to this point. And they're just suddenly going to drop in this money. Now, that it reminds me, of course, of 2020, where Everytown said this same thing, although they said it very early on in 2020, like before the pandemic early on in 2020. So, February is, I believe, when they announced that. And then they just didn't do it and never followed up as to why they didn't spend $50 million. They said they were going to spend $50 million. So this is actually a little bit less than they were claiming they were going to do in 2020. But they said they were going to spend $50 million and then they didn't do it. Now, obviously, the pandemic happened between when they announced that and when the election occurred. So that may have had some impact. They never explained it, but and people largely forgot about it because, well, there was other big news happening in 2020. So this is a little more interesting to see it happen at this point in July, August. Implies that that maybe they have this money already wrapped up and in their coffers somewhere. It hasn't shown up in FEC reporting because that lags by at least a month. So we might see it on the 20th of this month if it was brought in July, or we might not see it until next month sometime show up in the actual fundraising records that the FEC publishes. But yeah, I'll be really interested in see how this comes about. I mean, a donation that big, that in that short of a time period, likely means that it's coming from a major donor. Everytown's case would almost certainly be Michael Bloomberg. Giffords, basically there's two really big donors in the gun control space, and that's Michael Bloomberg, right, former mayor of New York, financial company named after him, obviously Bloomberg Terminals and all that stuff. Spent $1 billion to run for president, and I think he didn't win a single delegate, right? But either way, well-known figure. Then there's also Stephen Ballmer's family. I think it's more his wife who's involved in this, but they're big donors in groups like March for Our Lives and Giffords. So, and that's Ballmer is the former CEO of Microsoft. People mainly know him from that funny video of, like, was it, I don't know, Windows 95 or something, where he's up on stage doing his thing. He's also the owner, I think, of the Golden State Warriors now, something like that. One of the basketball teams. But anyway, those are the two big guys. There's a lot, they're not the only ones, but if you're pulling off donations like 45 million, it's probably coming from Michael Bloomberg or Stephen Ballmer or somebody along those lines. So we'll have to see how this all works out, or what we can get a hold of in terms of details on where this money's coming from, when it's going to be spent, where it's going to be spent, those sorts of things as we get closer to the election. We're getting closer to that period where these groups are actually going to start spending most of this money.
Right.
And so we're still waiting to see how that goes, but we're getting closer to that prime time season for the election.
Absolutely. And then sort of to wrap up where we started with news on the NRA, we have a story from Axios in the newsletter about their plans. They've announced plans already to file a lawsuit against that new Massachusetts omnibus gun control bill that I detailed in the members newsletter last week. And actually, as of today that we're recording, another group, Commonwealth 2A, has already filed a lawsuit. So we're seeing a multitude of legal challenges expected against this new bill. And it's sort of what you'd expect. If readers saw that piece, there's pretty much no realm of gun policies that bill didn't touch. And you had to expect that this was going to be the outcome, that gun rights groups, rather, were going to step in and try to sue.
Yeah, no surprise there. And we'll have to see how it unfolds in court. But perhaps why they didn't go quite as aggressive on the sensitive places restrictions as most of the other states that passed broom response laws did, because those states haven't had a great time in court. Although, a lot of those restrictions are still standing at the moment. Right. Because the Supreme Court has been pretty slow to take up challenges to these things, kind of somewhat to our surprise, I think. I think both of us expect them to be a little more active on this front, but it has only been 2 years, and court time is very slow for those who don't know. It doesn't move super fast most of the time. And this court has not been sending signals that it's going to move lightning fast on Second Amendment issues, even though it has ramped up comparatively to where it was the previous decade. But yeah, we will absolutely keep an eye on where that heads, and people should read your piece on the Massachusetts law if they want to get a better understanding of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's a 116 page behemoth. So it definitely is a lot included in there.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's all we've got for this week. We're gonna go and record our Q&A session now. Which, by the way, people who have the ability to ask questions in the Q&A podcast are members, and they also get the ability to come on the show. Which we've booked another member to be on the show soon. So look for that member segment. Always one of my favorite segments, just to get to better know who it is that helps fund this place, that keeps us going, that lets us do this reporting. But yeah, look for that coming up on Sunday from members, because members also get the podcast early. So if you like the podcast, the membership is it's pretty valuable. Plus, you'll get to read all the full details of all these analysis pieces we keep talking about. Of course, if you don't have that ability to buy a membership at the moment, you can subscribe to our free newsletter, and you'll still get all of the reporting for free. Generally speaking, that is something we put out there as both as a public service to inform people and a way of letting people know who we are. So sign up for the free newsletter if you haven't done that yet over at thereload.com. And then, we got a message real quick from the Dispatch, who's been sponsoring us in a promo swap for the last month and a half or so here. And we've got a little bit more to go. So hear why I like those guys. Okay, it is time once again to talk about the Dispatch. We're doing a promo swap. We've been doing it for a little while now, and it's a pretty easy thing for me to get behind because I've been a paying subscriber at the Dispatch really since it launched. And I think it's one of the best publications out there, especially in your center-right media, your conservative media, in large part because they focus, like we do here at The Reload, on hard news reporting first. That's what they were founded to do. That's where they put a lot of their energies. I read the Morning Dispatch every single day to keep up to date with what's going on in the country, in politics, and in news from a national perspective. And I would highly recommend it to anybody who's listening. There's a free trial if you follow the link in our bio here or down below in the description over at The Reload's website, or in the newsletter. You'll find the link to that free trial, so you can, not just take my word for it, but go and try out a subscription over there. You'll get access to all kinds of great original hard news reporting. That's their sort of bread and butter, I would say, especially stuff that, it's great to read the Morning Dispatch because it gives you a little bit of a different approach, a little bit of a different take on these stories that they're finding and that they're reporting, and they're gathering information and bringing it to you. And it just has a different editorial take as well. It's more for the politically homeless, for people like, I think there was 53% in the most recent Pew poll that wanted a different option than what they have in the current presidential election. So if you feel that way, I think you probably find yourself right at home over at the Dispatch. Of course, they have a big name and analysts and opinion writers there as well, who come from a center-right perspective, people you've heard of before, I'm sure. Jonah Goldberg, Steve Hayes, Kevin Williamson, I'll pun if you've been deeply immersed in online media for the last 15 years like I have. One of the best writers out there. And, it continues on down the line. They've got a really great lineup of writers over there. Chris Steyerwalt's another really good one. It's just a fantastic publication. And this is actually getting long. I don't think I'm supposed to go on for this long, but it's easy to do that when I'm talking about this, because I have a lot of respect for what they've done. Another independent publication, startup. They've really had a great success, and I think they're the model for our industry, and also a place where you're going to find value if you go over and check them out. So, click the link, get your free trial, try them out for yourself. You don't have to take my word for it. But yeah, the Dispatch, head over and check them out.